Please, someone let me know if you cannot hear me. But my name's Martel. I'm so excited to be joining you all virtually today. I'm on Coast Salish lands in Seattle, Washington today, and I'm so excited to talk with you about Indigenous evaluation. Wonderful. Okay, thank you for the affirmations in the chat. So yes, I'll be talking about reclaiming the narrative, how we decolonize evaluation through utilizing Indigenous evaluation methods. And I encourage participation throughout this time. We'll have a couple different ways for you all to engage, answer questions that I'll ask you. As you'll see, Indigenous evaluation is all about recognizing that we have knowledge, we have the ability to do evaluation and research. So I'm excited to also learn from you all today. And just a note on language in this presentation, I'll use the terms Native, Indigenous, American Indian Alaska Native interchangeably, and also honor the preferred identities of individuals when I talk about them, but language is often all of it like a very personal preference for Indigenous folks, and that could be like a whole other presentation, but just wanted to make that note. So before I jump into this work, I wanted to share a bit with you about what my background is and who I am. So Tansei Martel Hesketh Mitsigason. My name is Martel Hesketh. Hello. I am a member of the Michelle First Nation from Treaty 6 territory in Canada. My ancestors are Nahiawak or Plains Cree and Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk from Ganawake. I have grown up as a guest on Coast Salish land almost my entire life, and that's where I currently reside. I am an Indigenous evaluator. My Western educational background is I have a human biology degree from Stanford, and then a master's in public health from University of Washington. And for the last 3 years until the other week, I worked as an evaluator at Urban Indian Health Institute, which is a tribal epidemiology center, and I'll explain a bit about what that means. But I am currently the manager of evaluation in research at an organization called Indian Collective. So a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today is based on what I learned and what I did during my time at Urban Indian Health Institute, or UIHI, as we call it. So I'll just to acknowledge that this work definitely comes from there. And then any of the opinions and views that I share today are not representative of like Indian Collective. So just also wanted to add that disclaimer as well. But before I jump into sort of explaining what UIHI is and then Indigenous evaluation and those frameworks, I wanted to hear a bit from you all. So I would love to know who is joining me today. So I think there's actually another way for you to do this, but if you use the application, the app, you should be able to have a way to introduce yourself under the Q&A section. So if you just put your name, any like community or tribal affiliations or organizational affiliations, I would just love to know who you all are. If we were doing this in person or our larger workshop, normally we would spend time going around the room, just introducing each other, because also acknowledging that, introducing each other is a form of ceremony and also a way to integrate that into our evaluation work. So if you all could take the time to do that, I'd be super appreciative. So I'll just give you a moment. And I see that there's also another screen for those in the room where you can do a QR code. And Monica, I'm not sure if there's like a way for me to like see all the answers from my slide or from my app. Oh, actually, I can see it on this other small screen down here. Let me look at this real quick. Wonderful. It's nice to meet you, Michelle, Kate, Michaela, Nancy. I see other people are typing. Okay, wonderful. Continue to type, please. Add in your name, and I'll look at that as you finish too. But yeah, no, I just really like to have an understanding of who all is in the room, who I'm talking to, especially in these virtual times when it's through a screen. So who is Urban Indian Health Institute? So to give you all a little bit of background about sort of why this framework came to be and how, the Indigenous evaluation approach that I'll be talking about was developed, I want to make sure that, you all have some background on who UIHI is. So they are one of the 12 tribal epidemiology centers located across the country. And tribal epicenters are tasked with developing and delivering some like core public health infrastructure for both tribes and urban Indian centers across the country. So we are actually the only tribal epicenter that serves American Indian Alaska Natives nationally, because we focus on urban Indian communities across the country. So a lot of the work that I did was around supporting the Urban Indian Health Network, which includes like over 62 now organizations, including urban Indian health programs, and some social and health service organizations as well. So this work is important because a large percentage of Native people actually live in urban areas. So I wanted to, see what you all think is what percentage of Native people live in urban areas? What's your best guess? And you can throw a percentage out there. And I think this will also be a poll as well. Oh, someone has. Okay, yeah, I see some 50, 55, 70, 90, 50. Actually, so whoever said 70, you're very close. So the latest census had about 71% of Native Americans, and that includes folks that identify as other races as well as Native. A lot of us know that we have a lot of mixed ancestry, live in urban areas. So 71%. So kudos to whoever said 70. And Native people live in urban areas for lots of different reasons, right? Some of those are economic, some of them are historical, like the Indian Relocation Act that happened back in the 60s, 70s. Lots of us moved to urban areas to attend school, and a lot of folks also travel back and forth and moved between urban areas and rural areas, or maybe we just want to live in a city and we're just exercising our sovereignty in that way. So a little bit more in detail about what UIHI actually does. So UIHI serves to improve the health of American Indian and Alaska Natives by identifying and understanding health disparities, but also resiliency. We know that our communities are strong and have a lot of strengths. We would not have survived into this point if we did not have many strengths in our communities. So making sure we're also celebrating and understanding those as well. We work on strengthening public health capacity. So sometimes that looks like providing technical assistance to urban Indian organizations as well as tribes. We perform disease surveillance and disease prevention. A lot of the data that comes through the CDC is not always reported in a way that's helpful for our communities, or folks at the CDC aren't able to go kind of the extra step and do small numbers analysis for urban Native communities in certain areas. So then we just don't have data about that. So UIHI has a team of epidemiologists that will go and take that data and do different analyses to make sure that there's relevant information for urban Indian communities and organizations to make decisions and act upon and know how to best serve their communities. They also develop health promotion and disease prevention activities grounded in Indigenous methodologies. So UIHI also has a community grants program that they fund urban Indian organizations to implement chronic disease prevention activities, and many of them are based in Indigenous knowledge. So that could look like, helping develop a food sovereignty program, or doing some traditional medicine making classes with community. But all of the work that is done at UIHI is grounded in culture, and we conduct culturally rigorous research. So just stepping back for a second and thinking about the goals of the rest of this presentation. So I'll give a bit of a background on evaluation in Indigenous communities, kind of looking at why Indigenous evaluation research methods are needed. Then we'll talk specifically about UIHI's Indigenous Evaluation Framework. I'll take some time to explain that to you, kind of how it was developed as well. And then finally, I'll give some examples of what Indigenous evaluation has looked like in my work at UIHI during the last 3 years. And hopefully you'll get some ideas on how to implement it in yours. So another question for you all. So I know evaluation can be a loaded term for folks that have worked with programs, for folks working in Indigenous communities. So I wanted to throw this at you all and ask, what comes to mind when you think of the word evaluation? So if you had to just say, one word, or you can add a couple if you want. But yeah, what comes to mind? Well, let's see, assessment. Okay. Strategic planning, review, learning to improve. Okay, I like that. More assessment, measuring success, understanding, value. Yeah, right. Everyone's understanding the value of something. Metrics, alignment with goals, what's working, making better. Awesome. Yeah, keep adding those in there. So this is an exercise that I love doing in workshops because everyone sort of has a different experience with evaluation. Sometimes it's positive, more often it's like pretty darn negative for many reasons. But I do love the learning to improve and making it better. Those are definitely aligned with Indigenous evaluation. And then we have things like measuring success, right? And when you think about success, a question that I always have is, who's defining what success looks like? Is it our own communities, or is it some other outside entity that's saying, like, here are the indicators that you have to measure? And in that way, they're determining what, success looks like in that sense. So yeah, I see reflexivity, or that reflection. Awesome. So I feel like I'm seeing a good mix of, what you might think of as sort of like standard evaluation practice if you were to take a class in graduate school, as well as some themes that I think we'll really dive into and see how they're a part of, Indigenous evaluation. Awesome. So thank you everyone for participating. So I thought, who better to, tell you all what Indigenous evaluation can look like than some of the communities that we've shared, not this presentation with, but actually our whole 6-hour Indigenous evaluation workshop with. So this is a word cloud from one of our workshops when we asked at the end of it, what comes to mind when you think of Indigenous evaluation? And so I wanted, just to share this example with you all to see sort of the word cloud that was formed by them. So as you could see, storytelling, community, and culture are super central. There was also understanding, but you also see reflections in there as well, like what someone had added to this, intentionality, sovereignty, learning, empowerment, relationships, laughing. So it's always, ends up being a different word cloud. And if we're lucky, there's some little bit of overlap, but, really, I love this word cloud because you can tell storytelling and community are sort of the central themes that showed up for people after going through this workshop. And hopefully that's what you'll be able to take away after we go through this presentation today. So I wanted to take some time to talk about why Indigenous approaches to research and evaluation are needed. So we always like to start off by acknowledging that research and evaluation in the past has often been done by outsiders, and in a way that has done a lot of harm to our communities. So these are 2 examples. There are many more, but just wanted to share with you today, sort of how research has harmed Native communities in the past, or also like data, as you'll see in the second example. So the first example on the left is a screenshot from an article that was a study that was done in Ukqiavik, Alaska, which was previously known as Barrow. And researchers went into the community and found really high rates of alcohol use. The community explicitly asked the researchers not to share the results publicly. They wanted to, figure out what to do with them in a way that was like respectful. But the researchers did not listen to what the community wanted. They actually agreed to talk to the New York Times, who published an article, in this national news platform that basically portrayed the whole community as having, suffering from alcoholism, and didn't give any context, right? Like with any of these examples, it just shows the outcomes and not the reasons why Indigenous communities have these health outcomes. It didn't talk about how people might be self-medicating because of the intergenerational trauma that they've experienced from so many different reasons caused by settler colonialism. And this, publication resulted in a lot of harm to the community, not only in the sense that, like, obviously it's reinforcing these harmful stereotypes and these narratives without any of that context, but also some banks actually stopped lending to people that lived in that community. So it also impacted, the financial capital of the community as well. Then on the other side of the screen is a screenshot from a political article that was more recent, a couple years ago, actually. And it describes how during the COVID-19 pandemic, kind of in the thick of it in 2020, the federal government was not releasing COVID-19 data to tribal epidemiology centers. And tribal epidemiology centers have the same right to data as state health departments. They're public health authorities. So despite that the federal government had data about our communities, it wasn't releasing it to us. And that meant that all the tribal epicenters couldn't analyze that data and share it back with the tribes themselves so they could advocate for resources or allocate the appropriate resources to where they were most needed. So, this obviously had a really big impact on the ability to make decisions for the community during this public health emergency. So these are just two examples of how like data and research in the past have been sort of used by outsiders, or when, this information is controlled by other people, how it has harmed Indigenous communities. But it's, not all negative. And we like to share examples of what it can look like when Indigenous knowledge, is leading research and evaluation. So here we have a couple of examples of that. So on our first example on the left-hand side, that's a photo from the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute, and it is a photo of participants in a project that applied some principles of like wilderness programming, but combined with traditional American Indian Alaska Native knowledge, and an intervention that was designed to address health disparities in a tribal community. So specifically, this intervention was designed by Karina Walters, who's a member of the Choctaw tribe. And all of the authors on the article were identified as American Indian Alaska Native, and 4 of the 5 of them were also members of the Choctaw tribe, which is where this program was designed and took place. So in this program, when they were designing it, they drew upon, historical trauma frameworks, traditional knowledge, and like understanding of the importance of the connection to land and place, and actually had tribal members re-walk portions of the Trail of Tears that their ancestors walked, and considered effect on their contemporary tribal health for their communities. And when they spoke with participants about their experience, a lot of people sort of shared how that, being in that place, that engagement with like the land, and, the physical and emotional challenges really helped change health beliefs and attitudes and behaviors in individuals. And it was just a really cool example of how community-based participatory research can really center Indigenous knowledge and be an opportunity to actually do that. And so that's one example that we like to share. And then the one on the other side where you see the Indigenous health indicators is work that was done by the Swinomish Indian Tribal Community Environmental Health Program. The Swinomish tribe is located in Northwestern Washington, so I've actually worked with their program on a couple of projects. And I just think the work that they do is so fantastic. And this is an example of some community-based indicators that are specific and like grounded in Indigenous culture and knowledge that they developed. So they often, when they were working on their community environmental health work, they'd often encounter these frameworks that would not consider, key indicators of what environmental health looked like from an Indigenous lens. So when they created this, they worked across, with some other tribal nations, some Coast Salish nations specifically, and developed these indicators that included aspects of cultural use, of resilience, as well as community connection and self-determination. And, these are things that if you're going into like an environmental health class at like University of Washington, I'll like pick on my own alma mater, but like, right, they wouldn't teach you like, yes, these are the key indicators that you should be thinking about. So this is just, I think, such a wonderful example of how, you can have this collaborative process to create, your own frameworks that are centering traditional knowledge and those cultural values that then will give a more accurate representation of what health and wellness looks like for the community. And in addition, some of the work that they did through this too was also trying to reframe like the narratives around if, shellfish are exceeding a certain toxin level in the areas that they would traditionally harvest them. Normally, you just tell people like, oh, don't go harvest them. But what about reframing that as being like, oh, we should be holding the oil refineries accountable for the pollutants that they're dumping into the water. So trying to also reclaim that narrative and shift away from the individual blame, as well as doing that from like a culturally grounded standpoint. So, as I've kind of hinted at the beginning, Indigenous research and evaluation are Indigenous values. So Urban Indian Health Institute claims them as Indigenous values, and we recognize that Native people were the first researchers, the first scientists, the first engineers, the first people to invent permaculture on this land. And we also acknowledge that a lot of these knowledge systems and these practices that I'm referring to as research and evaluation have been co-opted by Western knowledge systems. So a really core part of Indigenous evaluation is empowering our communities and Native people to reclaim research and evaluation to tell their own stories. Because they are practices that we've always done, that our ancestors have done, even if we haven't called them that. So an example like I think of when I think about how my own ancestors practice research and evaluation is I think about the amazing like technology of the three sisters and how corns, beans, and squash, right, when they're interplanted in that way, all provide like nutrients to one another, how as the corn comes up first, it gives like a tall stalk for the beans as they come up to wrap around. So they have that framework. The beans are nitrogen fixing, so they're fixing nitrogen into the soil to benefit, right, the corn and the squash. And then as the squash comes up, it provides that ground cover to protect the area and kind of like ward away some weeds or make sure the weeds don't get sun so they can't grow. And that type of technology and knowledge, that wasn't just something that like, Indigenous people happened upon by accident. That was really intentional. That took, generations of observation, of experimentation, in addition to then sharing that knowledge, right? And then like, how do we share that knowledge with the future generations? And all of that work was done to benefit the communities. It all had a purpose, right, of like benefiting the communities. And, this, what you might think of as the like kind of scientific method, right, can be applied to a lot of like the protocols and practices that have happened in Indigenous communities. We didn't always call them that, right? We had different names for them. Maybe they occurred in like slightly different order, but we had those practices of observation, of recording, of sharing, especially through our stories, or knowledge sharing, teaching, and then passing that down. So, I always encourage folks, to think of, there's probably examples if you are Indigenous from your own community of ways that, you practiced research and evaluation. And so I always encourage folks to think about those and reflect on those, as well as acknowledge that not all of us have access to those stories, but there's also plenty of modern examples because we haven't stopped doing that work, even if we don't call it research and evaluation. Okay, so now I am going to spend some time talking about frameworks. So before I share UIHI's Indigenous Evaluation Framework, I wanted to share this Indigenous Evaluation Framework by the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. So this was kind of one of the first Indigenous evaluation frameworks that showed up in the literature. This is back in 2010. And it was developed in close partnership with the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, which includes 34 American Indian tribally controlled colleges and universities. And it really was meant to synthesize Indigenous ways of knowing with Western evaluation practice. And so to ground the framework, the consortium engaged in this extensive consultation process with different focus groups in major regions of the United States, cultural experts, educators, and evaluators who shared their concerns about evaluation and described how evaluation fits or kind of clashes with different cultural frameworks. So this article was a summary of those focus group discussions, and it kind of was able to develop these 4 core values for their Indigenous evaluation framework. So this work, is kind of the last value you can see is centered around tribal sovereignty. You also see kind of the people of a place. And so a lot of the this work was a really good starting point for the Urban Indian Health Institute's framework, but it didn't feel fully inclusive of urban Indian communities. So that was a goal with the Urban Indian Health Institute developing their own framework, was to develop an Indigenous evaluation framework that was also inclusive of both urban and tribal communities. So this is UIHI's Indigenous Evaluation Framework. And as you can see, it also has 4 core values, but they're different and adapted to be inclusive of urban Indian communities. So I'll go through and sort of explain each one in depth. The first value is communities created wherever Native people are. So this value is centering around the fact that regardless of where Indigenous people live, they always create community and see that we see in urban Indian centers. So our evaluation work starts in the creation of these communities. And the staff at UIHI and the work that's done is diverse. And the urban Indian community is diverse because of these historical policies that I mentioned, like the Relocation Act, but as well as lots of people that move between cities and reservations. But regardless of where Native people are, they always build these strong, beautiful communities, and they carry with them their cultural traditions to these urban communities. Next is being resilient and strength-based. So this is about using the tools of evaluation to identify solutions by and for the community. Oftentimes, if you've had experience with evaluation, it really often focuses on identifying deficits or gaps for improvement. It's getting a little better. But while those are important to note, we also need to be identifying and celebrating the successes, the strength, the joy, and resilience Because if we're not identifying those strengths, we're not telling the whole story of our Indigenous communities. We are strong and resilient people. So it's essential that we're also incorporating those strength-based and resiliency-focused factors as well. The next value is decolonizing data. So just like our ancestors did, any data that we're collecting should be used to serve the community. So every single question that we're asking on a survey, like we should know how that's going to go back, how it's going to be used to improve the program to benefit the community itself. And that's a part of practicing reciprocity within evaluation too. Like when we're asking for data from people, they're gifting that to us. So how can we make sure that we are then engaging in reciprocity and ensuring that anything they are gifting us, we are then using, giving back to them and, whatever form that may be. This value of decolonizing data also recognizes that data is more than just counts, although Indigenous people did collect numbers, and I'll talk about it, but it's also recognizing that art and storytelling and relationships are all forms of like valuable and rigorous data that Indigenous people have always collected and observed. And those Indigenous ways of knowing are as equally valid as Western or like academic ways of knowing. And then the final value is centering the community. So community involvement in evaluation is critical, and really prioritizing building and maintaining strong relationships with the community. So whenever I've been working in community with evaluation, developing ways to get community feedback, whether that's because like I'm in close relationship with them, or I am engaging, including them in focus groups or talking circles to get feedback on the evaluation. It's essential that we, are centering the community and getting their feedback in the evaluation itself, because like I mentioned earlier, oftentimes it's like other people that are defining what success looks like for our communities. So evaluation is a really important inflection point for reclaiming what we want success to look like for Indigenous communities, and make sure that's also can be based on our community values, on our cultural values. And also as a note, we did finally submit this framework as a paper for publication, and it will be coming out next year in the Canadian Journal Program Evaluation, which has like this really cool section called Roots and Relation. So it'll have a lot of really cool resources about Indigenous evaluation in addition to our framework paper. So you can keep an eye out for that if you're interested in learning more. Okay, so now I have another activity for us all, and hopefully I don't run into any technological issues. So I have a video that I'm going to share. It's pretty short, but it was developed by Urban Indian Health Institute a few years ago and features the director of evaluation and research, Dr. Rose James, talking about Indigenous evaluation. So I'm going to share my screen and we will all watch it. And then I want to hear from you all sort of what you thought of it afterwards. So there'll be another opportunity to use the poll function. So, sort of be thinking about, what am I feeling when I'm watching this? What ideas or thoughts does it bring up? So let me share a different part of my screen, and hopefully this will be the right one. And if I play it and you can't hear anything, please send me a message in the chat. Because I know that's a common issue on Zoom. Okay, so here we go.
When we talk about owning things like evaluation, it's not about judging people. It's the exact opposite of that. It's about understanding people and what creates change. We're trying to tell a story, and it's something that as Native people we've always done. We brought some of our program people together to talk about how to do culturally appropriate evaluation. We started with a traditional weaving lesson to encourage the idea that documentation and learning should be woven into every program.
See this part right here? You always pull that until that's tight, not too tight.
And then just pull.
Okay?
Okay.
We are trying to help other people understand that this work we're doing is important and why.
We have strengths in our community and we know what helps, but translating that to funders is a challenge of do they see the value in what we're doing, because we see those results directly through our kids and the kids we work with.
Between speaking with our youth and speaking with our elders and with members of the outside community, it's like speaking different languages.
So in that sense, it can feel like a burden. One additional thing we have to do we have to really ask them to do a survey now? And yet it can also be extremely rewarding.
A lot of what I tried to do is I really invited, tribal members to come to my office. I invited them to give me a call. I invited them to come talk to me after an event, because I valued the fact of people telling me face to face, and whether like how the event went, like what was good, what was bad, what could I have done better.
We use that asset survey that you might be familiar with to help them to self-identify where the strengths are in their community, whether they know their neighbor or how they can, because we know it, but we haven't always been given an opportunity to have a discussion around it.
Oftentimes it can be something where you bring in images or you ask people to create art that illustrates what transformation they feel that they've experienced.
We just ran our meetings a little bit differently, but we were still able to get the outcomes that the grant wanted. Really having to speak two different languages, like being able to meet with the community and hear their feedback and translate that to our funders.
Just figure out what outcomes are important for your program and for your community, and then measure the things that relate to that outcome. Use what you learn to improve your programs and connect with the people.
I think that those true connections and that acknowledgement of making those connections is what we've learned as Native people, is what we're trying to maintain.
Evaluation is something that we should own as part of what we do in our everyday work, define for ourselves, and use as a tool that works for our communities.
When you're twisting, you're going to feel the difference in your fingers after the day is over with. Your fingers are going to get sore. Gina did her bracelet.
On my big old head.
Rose finished her rose. Rose did a rose.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for watching that with me. I'll go ahead and get my screen set up again. But yeah, would love to hear from you all for a couple minutes. Just, what do you think about the video? I guess any takeaways? So I don't know if you can just get like an open discussion set up and like the polls or the Q&A. Just for folks to sort of share some of those reflections. Did you like it? Did you dislike it? What do you think of it? Oh, awesome. Okay, I can see some responses now. Love the training. Not judging, seeing what works. That's something that I really love about this video, and like a quote I always kind of go back to is, right, it's not about judging, it's about understanding. Like so often I feel like when people hear the word evaluation, right, you get kind of scared. You're like, oh my God, am I not going to meet these, like, they're going to judge me on some metrics, but really reframing it as like, how can we understand what's happening and knowing, and kind of being flexible, and that sometimes it's, maybe the indicators that are set for us or that we set aren't the best ones. Having to speak two different languages. I definitely feel that, especially when working with funders. And if folks have more questions about working with funders and we have like the Q&A at the end, I'm happy to talk about that too. Working with hands to learn new knowledge while discussing. So I'm just going to cough real quick. Yes, I love working with hands and discussing, like that's one of those examples too, where I think about all of like the trendy like design thinking workshops or something. Right, it's they always have like Play-Doh or something in the middle of the tables, or right, for adults, just for keeping your hands busy. And that's something Native people have always done, right? Like when you're in community, you're often doing something with people. Maybe you're like processing herbs, maybe you're weaving cedar, but you're having those discussions, you're like staying engaged. You don't have to be like in a total classroom setting, like staring at a screen, right? So that's such a good, such a good example. Having a hard time seeing how this is different from other evaluations, or maybe you have been doing Indigenous evaluation all along. Maybe you have, maybe you've been having the right idea. And helpful to do things together to build relationships. Exactly. Evaluate with elders while doing something. Yeah. I know too, when we have worked with our elders in the past too, like, we're never just asking them to fill out a survey. They're not going to fill out a survey. Like, we're going to sit down, we're going to talk with them. You need to have those relationships with them. Right. Also, like that storytelling, right, to understand people and what creates change is also related to that, especially when working with elders. Then rigidity versus flexibility in funding may make this difficult. Absolutely. And that's definitely like a barrier that UIHI has faced, and that I know people still face, and it can often just be so dependent on who your program officer is, or who your funder is. So it can definitely vary. I think when you have opportunities to advocate with funders about trying out these different approaches, even if maybe it's like doing one extra thing. And I'll give some like concrete examples coming up here in a bit, of like, maybe you do a change story, maybe you use like artwork for kind of one, to supplement your evaluation. And then sharing that with them anyway, because oftentimes what we would do at UIHI is, maybe even if our like funders didn't explicitly like ask for something, we would still share those stories with them. And that's really what had the most impact. That's what they really like took away like the most from, our reports, et cetera, et cetera. I see folks in the chat too. Yeah, the evaluation techniques are oriented in a positive direction, tailoring evaluation to a community. Exactly what does success look like for different people? And using the evaluation process, which includes laughter to deepen community. So like absolutely humor can be it's like a wonderful tool that Indigenous people have always used in like our politics, in like all of our work, right? So we are awesome at humor. And so like finding ways to incorporate that to evaluation. I don't know if I have any examples of it in this slide deck, but one thing that like we would often do is we use like memes as like a response mechanism. And the memes would be like, coordinated with like an actual, like, how do you feel about Indigenous evaluation? We had like a meme for like confused or mad, and then people would respond with those. But it also like helps engagement, right? Like if people are engaged and invested, they're going to give you like more like relevant data and feedback as well. So humor and laughter are super important tools in Indigenous evaluation. Awesome. Thank you everyone so much for watching that and sharing your feedback. I am like really thrilled that worked really smoothly. I always just expect there to be like technical difficulties when I share videos on Zoom. So thank you all for participating in that. So to make sure that I have time to get through some of these other examples and to have some time for Q&A at the end, I'm going to move on. So I'll be in this next section, I'll share some more specific examples of how I've applied Indigenous evaluation, how my colleagues at Urban Indian Health Institute have applied Indigenous evaluation in our work. And to start that section off, I wanted to share this quote by LaFrance and Nichols. Those were the Indigenous researchers that developed the Indigenous evaluation framework for the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. So the quote that we have here is, "Telling stories is fundamental to being Indigenous peoples. Stories are a method and means for understanding the consequences of lived experiences. Indigenous evaluation is about telling stories." So I just love that, kind of really reinforcing that evaluation is a form of storytelling. So I'm always keeping that at the core of all the Indigenous evaluation work that I do. So community is created wherever Native people are. So I kind of like to talk about an example of how we exhibit this value through a specific method called social network analysis. So a key factor with Indigenous evaluation is sometimes when we'll introduce it or talk about it, folks will be like, oh, well, what's like the secret sauce? What's like the one method that I use, right? To use, like if I implement this method, I'll be doing Indigenous evaluation. But it's not about that. Right. I think about how like my ancestors didn't often like drag all the tools with them as they migrated across the plains. Right. They looked at what was in their environment, and then they like adapted to that environment. So really being like cognizant of like what tools can I use that best fit into like the goals of the evaluation and to serve the community. So one of those tools that I've used in the past is called social network analysis. Basically what it is, it's a way of documenting and displaying relationships between individuals or organizations. So in this image on the screen, every dot represents an organization, and the size of that dot corresponds to the number of connections that organization has with other orgs. And all of these organizations are working on traditional like ecological knowledge or like traditional plants and foods knowledge and sharing that with their communities and with other folks. And so we have the arrows going between them all showing how that knowledge is spreading. The color of the arrows indicates the type of work. So the lighter the arrows corresponds to maybe like less intensive work, like maybe just providing like funding or advising. And then like the darker arrows are like we co-manage programs together, co-develop programs. So this is just one example of, what can it look like to practice this value? And another sort of example of this I want to share, and I'm also going to share my screen on a different window again. Is how we took this social network analysis, and we wanted to make sure we were gifting it back to the community. We gathered a lot of information from people to create it, so we wanted to make sure it was accessible back to folks. So you should be able to see this story map up here. So this is a native plants and food story map that I built. I started this project a long time ago and it's finally public, so it's very exciting. But basically, the goal of this was to take all the information that we had collected through that survey, looking at all those connections between these Indigenous plants and foods educators, and share it back with the community, and also share the stories behind those connections. Like, what does that mean? So we just have a little intro here. And then in a different section, you can see we also like outline like how this story happens in relation to place. So really, right, centering the fact that like community and this knowledge is created where people like Indigenous people are, how it's centered on place. There's a specific story here about this Native infusion curricula called Rethink Your Drink that was developed by Valerie Segrest. And as you scroll down, it shows how it was like who was involved in the development of it. You know, some photos on the side too, but also how this knowledge spread to initially Garden Raised Bounty in Olympia. Sorry, there's a cat that's going to try and interrupt me right now. The Indigenous Sports and Recreation Council. And then finally, how because it reached that Indigenous Sports and Recreation Council and the work that they do, it spread to over 300 nations and organizations across British Columbia. So, you know, in traditional evaluation work, maybe you aren't thinking about like, oh, like, how are we displaying all of this on a map? Or how are we, you know, making sure, like connecting it to place and community. But this is one example of how we try to do that within, you know, our evaluation work to really practice that value of communities created wherever Native people are. Okay. So the next value that I mentioned was resilient and strength-based. So there's lots of ways that we, you know, try to implement this within the evaluation work that we do. But one of my favorite ways is through this method called change stories. So as I mentioned, Urban Indian Health Institute gives out community grants to urban Native communities across the country. And part of the evaluation for that is we ask these grantees to share with us like a couple images and like a short description of what they thought, you know, what they saw like the most significant change like in their community was, like one story that kind of represents that. So in this example, it was from one of our community grantees, and it was them talking about how they invited their community to make acorn flour using their ancestors' tools. And in the description, you can see, you know, kind of get the sense that it strengthened the, you know, community's connection with the land. It was also this opportunity for intergenerational learning. It talks about shared time together with youth and elders, that connection to culture, right? Learning about our traditional ways. And then in the photos itself, you can see a lot of physical activity, because if you've ever tried to grind acorn flour by hand, you know, it's really difficult and your arms are very sore afterwards, right? So all of that information is contained within this change story. So not only is it right centering on the strengths of this community, what they're doing well, how they're reclaiming that ancestral knowledge, but also there's a ton of like really relevant, useful evaluation data in these change stories as well. So that's one example of, you know, how you can, you know, develop ways to collect data that is resilient and strength-based, and still gives you like super, you know, rigorous data to share with funders and back with the community as well. I have another example, kind of thinking about how we report out data in resilient ways, even when that data is dealing with traumatic topics. So I did want to give a content warning before I share this next slide. The example includes statistics about sexual violence towards Native women. So if you need to like step away, take a moment, please do that. Please take care of yourself. And after I explain the slide, we'll have a moment of silence just to honor the data and the stories in it. So I wanted to give everyone that content warning before sharing the next slide. So quantitative data can be shared in beautiful ways, just as our ancestors did, right? They did that through artwork, through beading, through many different methods. And it can be done in a way that connects people to tell culturally relevant stories to the community. So the data shared on this slide is from some of UIHI's work around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And this specific study was collected from Native women in the Seattle area. And here you can see the data is presented on a ribbon skirt. And if you're familiar with the significance of ribbon skirts, or if you're not, they tell the story of Indigenous womanhood, adaptation, survival, and resiliency. And we wear ribbon skirts, and they say when the bottom touches the land, the earth knows who we are. And so each of the ribbons represents a prayer. So in this reporting, and reporting it in this way, the trauma of the Native women in this study, those statistics are held in prayer. And the first statistic on the top tells us what happened. The ones in the middle show how that trauma and injustice were manifested. And then the last ribbon on the bottom is where that healing can come from, because it's closest to the land, closest, right, in talking to our relationship to land, to our ancestors, and healing from that historical trauma. So I wanted to share this example because even when we're dealing with these statistics and this work that is really traumatic for our communities, there are ways to incorporate the cultural knowledge that our communities have, right, to like honor and like really humanize these statistics and tell it in a really meaningful way. So I just wanted to now take a moment of silence to honor these women and their stories that were shared for this work. Okay, thank you everyone for participating. So next I want to talk about what does it look like when we talk about decolonizing data in Indigenous evaluation. So part of decolonizing data is reimagining what we consider data. And so on the right-hand side of the screen is an example of an art piece that one of our interns created for the intern evaluation. So every summer, Urban Indian Health Institute hosts undergraduate and graduate student interns. And as a part of the evaluation of the program is we ask them to create an art piece where they share what they learned during their time at Urban Indian Health Institute. So one of our interns, Abaki, created this collage on the right-hand side, which shows her great-grandma processing traditional herbs. That's who's in the image. Behind it is our code. So maybe you've also been to graduate school and had to deal with R. If not, it is a like a way of doing statistical analysis that is commonly used. And in the front, she has the words, "We have always been scientists." And so in her artist statement that she submitted, this piece of artwork shows how her work was grounded in that traditional knowledge, but supplemented by these Western practices, by these tools and technologies that we have access to today. And then on the left-hand side of the screen is actually UIHI's visual logo and sort of how we explain our work and how we decolonize data. So this visual logo was developed really following the traditional practice of using art to tell stories. So the UIHI director, Abigail Uckelhawk, worked with Blackfeet ledger artist John Papillon to create this visual representation of how we decolonize data at UIHI. So if you're not familiar with ledger art, it's a really beautiful and cool style of art. I really love it. But it uses these pages from old ledgers, right? Like ledgers that were kept at forts that has all, like they have all these counts of like lumber and men and like goods and horses, et cetera, et cetera. And in ledger art, right, we like Indigenous people superimpose over all of those colonial counts with beauty and grace. So in this image, you can see it has a woman who comes in her full regalia, so her full cultural strength and knowledge to gather, analyze, interpret, to tell our stories through data. But she sits at a modern desk and has a computer representing, how we're using the best of Western technology, but that it's contained, right? That's not what's driving her work. And you notice her feet are bare and at her feet are corn. So that represents her grounding in cultural values of land and place, and the nurturing of future generations, right? Those seeds from the corn that we're planting, to grow in the future. So decolonizing data is done for one purpose, and that's for the love of Native people. And so another example in talking about decolonizing data is recognizing all the ways that Indigenous people have always collected, not only, right, like beautiful like artwork and stories, but also counts. So sometimes I'll like encounter this impression that like Indigenous evaluation is only like qualitative like methods. And we're like, no, we've always counted stuff as Native people, and we continue to through Indigenous evaluation. So one example we like to share are the Lakota winter counts. So they're an example of how Native people have always been collecting, quantitative data since time immemorial. And if you're not familiar with the winter counts is the Lakotas kept counts of things like horses, men, like resources, and they did this on buffalo skin or deer hides, and it recorded like important events as well. And so it kind of acted like an annual calendar that showed us Lakota histories visually. And something that I learned more recently is that a few Indigenous organizations are sort of like reclaiming this practice and utilizing kind of a method similar to the Lakota winter counts to like reflect on their year and do kind of like an annual reflection and like have images and add to it, just reclaiming that practice, this evaluation practice and reflection practice that, Lakota people have done since time immemorial. And then the final value, centering the community. So there's lots of things to think through and lots of contradictions at times when you're trying to center the community within evaluation. As folks mentioned, working with funders when they might have different needs or interests is always a challenge. Hopefully in the future, those will get better. And I know part of the work that I did at UIHI is working with funders, was giving Indigenous evaluation workshops to folks at like the CDC and NIH so they could understand these methods as well, and not get as much pushback when trying to use them. But also on this note, one of the resources that the annual meeting organizers will share after this presentation includes an annotated bibliography that has a bunch of citations of different Indigenous evaluation frameworks. Like really good resources are in there. So part of our reasoning for sharing that with you all is that if you're out there and trying to work with funders, writing evaluation proposals, et cetera, and want to like cite these frameworks, because we know that like citations are such a form of currency, right? In sort of these like academic circles and when working with funders. So that's a resource that like we're sharing with you because we can help move that needle and have more funders understand that like this way of conducting evaluation is not only like is equally valid, but is going to result in like more effective and useful information from our communities. So anyways, as we're thinking about centering the community, oftentimes, right, we're balancing what funders want, what community wants, but there are ways to kind of do both at once. And one of those ways I love to share are visual logic models. So most of you are probably familiar with what a logic model is. Normally it looks like a big document with a lot of words and boxes, right, where you have the activities, like the input, short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the ways that we try to, shift that to really center the community, how do we make this into something we can like share with our communities that like resonates, is through visual logic models. So the example that I have on the screen is a visual logic model from, I believe this is also the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. So you can see it actually has like those main components of a traditional logic model. It has the activities, short-term outcomes and then long-term outcomes, but it's displayed in this visual way, right? That's also intuitive. As you're like, okay, I'm climbing this mountain, as I'm going up the ladders and putting in that effort, moving from the activities to then seeing those short-term outcomes. And then later on, as you get higher up on the mountain, those long-term outcomes. And then they have like the participants of the program, represented by the eagles flying overhead, which is their summer employment students graduate and then seek higher education. So this is an example of how, one of the tools that we use and to center the community while also, sort of delivering on some of those standard like deliverables that funders might want. But it's also something we could literally like print out and share, with members of our community to help them understand like what this program is doing and, how it might benefit them. Another way that we work on centering the community is through story maps. So this is another example of a story map, a different one from the one that I shared earlier, where we took the information that we collected through those change stories. So the story that I shared about grinding acorn flour with like the ancestral tools, that was an example of a change story. So that we collected from a community grantee. So it was, we've collected this information for multiple years from multiple community grantees. And so part of the ways that like we wanted to center community was being intentional about how are we sharing these stories? How are we not just like including them in our reports to the CDC and then like sending them off and then like never seeing them again, but how are we sharing them back with our grantees and like the broader urban Native community to see how the work that we've been doing has been benefiting communities like across the country, or enabling communities, right, to like implement these programs to improve health and well-being. So the story map was how we did that. It's in like the previous one, it's interactive. So on each of those little points that you see on the map is one of the community grantees that's worked with UIHI or currently is a community grantee of UIHI. And if you click on it, it talks about each of the organizations. And then along the top of the screen, you can see the grants for Native wellness. And in that section, if you scroll on it, And I can send a link to this too. This is also available on the Urban Indian Health Institute website. So I'll share this with you all if you're curious to look through it some more. But under that Grants for Native Wellness section, it has some highlights from different grantees sharing about how like Native Health in Arizona like partnered with like the county health department and has this like amazing video about how to make blue corn mush. So that video was shared publicly. So we have that video included in the story map, or it has like some photos and quotes from participants from Native American Youth and Family Services in Portland, Oregon, and the incredible work that they did with their garden there, and like beautiful pictures of like all of the fruits they harvested and talking about how they shared that back with the community during COVID, and in food boxes for elders. So really how we wanted to center community with this work is making sure that we're sharing, you know, those stories back, and reflecting back all of the successes of the urban Native organization community that we've worked with through this program. And then finally, kind of related to centering the community, an important part of being able to do that is making sure that there is a reflection loop in place. And I know that was sort of one of the words that came to someone's mind when I asked them what they thought of evaluation, right? But it's like about that program improvement, about that reflection. So really making sure that any data that's collected is being used to benefit the community. And maybe that's to adjust a program, maybe it's to get more funding. But whatever it is, it's working to create better outcomes for the community. So something, you know, that I always think about is if I'm in community and I'm asking folks to fill out a survey, or I'm asking them to share information. And if like an elder came up to me and asked, why are you asking me these questions? Like, what are you going to use this for? Making sure I know exactly what each piece of information is going to be used for, right? And how it's going to go back and benefit the community. That's central to, you know, practicing reciprocity, and being like a responsible Indigenous evaluator. And by doing that, you can build those relationships with community. And I know oftentimes one of the big barriers that folks face is like engagement. So like, how do we get community members to fill out surveys, or to want to participate in interviews, et cetera, et cetera. And I heard this really fantastic story when I was giving an Indigenous evaluation workshop earlier this year in Standing Rock. And it was a gentleman, I don't remember exactly what community he was from, but he was telling me how in their tribal community, they like really wanted to increase engagement and evaluation, because they were like, we're sending all these surveys out and no one responds. So they started like really incentivizing them, like having some really amazing incentives and like feeding people if they'd come and, you know, fill out surveys. So they went like, you know, very heavy-handed on the incentives for a while. But then eventually, after they got the community engaged and were really intentional about explaining to them like, oh, here's what we're using this information for. We're going to use this to, like make sure whatever like telecom projects that we have are going to like reach all the people that need it, or like et cetera, like really explaining what that information will be used for. Then they found, they were like, whoa, everyone's just like, we actually don't have to offer any incentives. Like everyone, you know, at the times maybe they weren't able to because of some project budgets, like they still had super high engagement on a bunch of their community surveys. So I just like to think of that story too in relation to this of like, you know, also as a part of this reflection loop, right, that informing the community and decision makers can help make like the other parts of this reflection loop a lot easier, help, you know, make, if people are engaged and they know that the data that they're sharing with you is going to be used for something and useful, then they're going to be more likely to take the time to share that with you. So I was thinking of that story as I was looking at this slide, and really love that example that that gentleman shared. So before we switch over into just some like open discussion, have some time for question and answers, I wanted to just really re-emphasize what Indigenous evaluation is. So it is a way of doing evaluation that's grounded in Indigenous knowledge and the values, and is centered on the community. You know, a lot of the changes they mentioned aren't in the specific tools that are being used. It's really in the process, the way the evaluation is being done, and reorienting who has power in the evaluation process. And in Indigenous evaluation, Indigenous people have that power. Then it's also a reclamation of evaluation as an Indigenous practice, and using that to improve the health and well-being of our communities. And as I mentioned, you know, Indigenous people have always collected both qualitative and quantitative data, and they've always used it to benefit the communities. So I always think about, when I'm developing evaluation, how am I honoring that practice, recognizing that Native people are the first evaluators, that you don't need an expensive graduate degree from whatever school to collect valuable information, or to use, you know, analyze and use valuable information to benefit our communities. Right? Native people were the first researchers and evaluators on this land, and those practices were purposely co-opted from us, and they are absolutely ours to reclaim. And Indigenous evaluation is about reclaiming that and recognizing that. It also questions whose knowledge is prioritized and who should be conducting the evaluation. So I encourage you to read through the annotated bibliography that will be shared. There's lots of like good papers and discussions in it, talking about, like, you know, what does it mean to have an Indigenous evaluation? What can you call an Indigenous evaluation? Is it, you know, only when it's being led by Indigenous people? And like, what does that mean? And then finally, Indigenous evaluation is about decolonizing knowledge systems, right? So as I mentioned earlier, honoring those traditional ways of knowing, recognizing that they're as equally as valid as, you know, Western academic ways of knowing, that like it really, like, beautiful and applicable theory have been created in our communities, and that we can reclaim that practice and do that again. And reclaim our narratives as Indigenous people, you know, through this work. So thank you, everyone. I wanted to make sure that we had some time for just discussion and questions. So I'm not sure what the easiest way to do this is, but you know, we're welcome to throw it in the chat if you're on Zoom, or maybe either the like Q&A thing as well, or you could, like, if you're in the room, I think, go up and speak.
Hi, Martel. This is Carly, the room host for this session. I just want to say Chimigwich, thank you. I'm also from Canada. I'm First Nations. And I took the evaluation training when you guys came up here in May at the Alaska Indigenous Research Program. So it was really great. Thank you again for sharing. So yeah, we do have some time for discussion. So again, folks, if you have questions, really encourage you to open up the guidebook app and enter those into the Q&A. We're also trying to monitor the Zoom chat as well, but if you're trying to ask questions in Zoom, sometimes those are missed, so please use the app just so that everyone can see as well. And Martel also shared a bunch of resources that are on the guidebook app as well. There's about 5 different handouts, and there's even a data evaluation worksheet that really is great to kind of do some self-reflection and planning for your own projects or programs. So that was really great. Thank you, Martel. There's an overview, there's some more information on using surveys, evaluation storytelling, and then a snapshot on Indigenous evaluation. So yeah, how would you like to run discussion, Martel? Should we just look at the questions you have on the screen or take questions from the audience.
Yeah, I think if folks have any questions that they'd like to ask, maybe we could just open up the floor for questions right now, or any just like thoughts or feedback. Like I said, I'm always learning alongside everyone too, so really welcome that as well.
Great, sounds good. If any folks in the room have a question, you can raise your hand. I'll come run over and give you the mic so that everyone can hear you. We have a question.
Waka mayaw ko nga irusara ko nga kipaklo ka ko nga kagana ka ko nga alak mingo nga kwikpagmingo nga. My name is Valerie and I come from the Lower Yukon village of Alakanak. Currently I reside in Anchorage and represent ANTHC. I had a couple of questions, but first I'd like to make it very clear. Every time that I was raised by my grandparents, every time we sat and discussed anything, and everything was culturally relevant. That you don't sit there and you don't sit there and laugh. Laughter is not a prerequisite to engaging with the Indigenous society. You're demeaning a lot of our knowledge when you think you have to make light of it. And I've seen this a few times, and I've been seeing this over and over again, that you must smile to approach us. If you did that to my mom would not share anything with you. She'd think immediately that you're crazy. Your mental capacity is not there. Why would she waste her knowledge on you and sharing it to you, who are clearly crazy person? Okay, now that we have that as a basis, don't do that. The other is, we've always seen Indigenous knowledge as science. So equate that, please. It is incremental change. That's how we derived our knowledge, was seeing this change happening. And change is inevitable. This was the cornerstone of a Yupik and Supik person that I am. You're gonna see change. If you cannot catalog that, that means that you're not learning. So, you have to think about that. You have to think in those terms. Think in terms of that worldview. Koyana ilaksoglo.
Thank you, Valerie. Martel, did you have a response or any comments?
Oh, just thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing your perspective and the sharings and learnings that you're teaching me. So, kinanaskomitten to you.
Thank you, Valerie, for sharing. Does anyone else have questions? I see there's a question here on the app. This was asked a little while ago, but would you consider using network analysis to be Indigenous evaluation, or is it more culturally responsive evaluation tool?
I think kind of it falls into that, I guess, that same like thought category as it could be either, right? It just depends on the context. Like you could utilize social network analysis within a framework of culturally responsive evaluation or within a framework of Indigenous evaluation. I think we're really making sure that we're separating the specific tools from the frameworks is important because you can utilize many different specific data collection methods. Those can fit in different communities. As I mentioned, right, as we just heard, community context will differ depending on where you are. So I think kind of separating that thought of like, oh, does this tool always fit within the specific framework versus how am I understanding, being in relationship with this community, what are their values, and then understanding what tools best fit into that. So in that sense, it could fit into both. It just sort of depends on the context and who you're working with.
Great, thank you. I see another comment here Barriers, time and funding for travel to build relationships. It's really important to consider, especially for off-road communities. Just a personal comment, I think, building communities or building relationships with communities is important to, do in the beginning, co-designing your project, but also throughout implementation, and then evaluation too. Like maybe you need to think when you first start your project, okay, I want to do this type of evaluation. How do we get there? And what are the funding and resources we need to get there to make it happen and to get really valuable feedback that is not only important to your project, but to the community, like Martel had mentioned in her presentation. Are there any other questions here in the room or online? Again, you can use the app to submit your questions. Maybe not a question, maybe some thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Curious to know if someone has an ongoing project, what type of evaluation methods are you thinking about using or currently using? Was this presentation helpful? Did it get you thinking about maybe some methods that you could possibly bring into your work?
Oh, I do see a question, another one from the guidebook app. I didn't see the original one, but it's referencing basically about whether non-Indigenous led projects should use this framework. So that's a good question. I think like with any Indigenous knowledge, when I'm out here sharing this publicly, it's also because it can be beneficial for other communities. I think where, if you're not like an Indigenous led project, like understanding, right, like where you're giving credit to, and also if you're working with Indigenous communities, how do they have decision-making power within that evaluation? And I would encourage you to read through the annotated bibliography that was shared, because there are some specific like papers and folks that have written at length about like, what does it mean for, like, can non-Indigenous people practice Indigenous evaluation? What does it mean to be a good accomplice or ally within this? And what does that require? So I would direct you towards those resources, but also acknowledge that there's like valuable lessons that can apply to many different communities within, this knowledge, just like how the other knowledge that I shared, right, like is beneficial. Lots of traditional knowledge from Indigenous people is beneficial to the broader communities. So.
Very important. I see some more comments coming in on the app. Someone says, thank you. I found it very helpful to have specific examples of what it can look like. I really love the visuals, thinking about art as an evaluation tool. I think that's really cool to see it expressed in a different way than, a data set or a pie chart or, what you would typically think of. Someone else says, it's so important to evaluate along the way. Too often evaluation is an end piece. Very true. I think it's important to kind of check in with everybody on your team, your partners, throughout the whole, project life cycle. It's really important to do, to maybe kind of pivot, reevaluate, if something's not working, if something's working really well, it's great to celebrate success too.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the projects that I worked on recently was developing an evaluation plan for a guaranteed basic income pilot program for Indigenous pregnant mothers in the Seattle area that will be launching probably next year. So as a part of it, like our community partner brought us on like at the very beginning, as they were still actually designing their program, for us to start thinking about like, what do we want this evaluation to look like? And it was really wonderful to be a part of that from the beginning, because then we could really orient the evaluation questions in the community values. So part of the work that I did was doing talking circles and asking people like, what does like a healthy, happy, like Native or Pacific Islander or Alaska Native family in Seattle look like? Like, what does that feel like? What are the values we already have as a community that we can build upon to get there? And it was like through those questions that then guided like the overall framework that was developed for that. So definitely advocate for doing the evaluation at the very beginning, like planning it out, and also making sure that you're including that community perspective too, so that the community is the one defining what success looks like what good outcomes look like. And I also see there's a question in the Zoom chat that says they don't have access to the app, but the question is finding Indigenous evaluators, especially those located in Alaska. They have an idea of a few of them and they are very busy. Is there a list of evaluators? That's a good question. I have not come across like a consolidated list so far. I know that there is like an organization called, oh my gosh, I'm gonna blank on the name of it. It's through like Better Evaluation, I think, and they do a lot of work around culturally responsive evaluation, but they're also starting to partner with Indigenous evaluators and have like some sharing lessons around culturally, though they're calling it's basically Indigenous evaluation, but they have like a longer word for it. So that might be a potential resource. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the website off the top of my head. Otherwise, I know there are like groups, like interest groups that attend like the American Evaluation Association conference. It's like specifically the Indigenous evaluators or like the Indigenous Evaluation Working Group. So if you're able to get connected to them, that could also be another potential resource, but I haven't come across like one full consolidated list, although that would be really helpful.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Oh, I have one in the room here.
This is more of a comment than a question, I suppose, but thank you so much, Martel, for sharing your insights with us here today and bringing that knowledge to this space. I think it's an incredibly important component of the work that all of us are doing when we're considering how we're going to move forward with projects that are currently underway or even in the planning stages. I now live and work on traditional Yupik homelands in Yagig, Alaska with my partner. And we're beginning to develop a community-led environmental monitoring program in that region for those communities. And I just wanted to point out that in your presentation here, you brought up ArcGIS story maps a couple of times. And that's a component that I kind of forgot about, but it's such a powerful tool, and I'm pretty sure, as I recall, you don't necessarily need to be proficient in ArcGIS to build a story map, and that's such a wonderful tool to utilize that I think is probably underutilized or not known about as much as it could be at this particular juncture. But it's a wonderful way to tell a story arc, and I think that's probably the future of how we transfer and distill this information to prospective funders. Another just plug in here really quick, since we just had a question about Indigenous evaluation. There is a group here based, I think, out of Palmer that I am recently involved with through an Indigenous land stewardship course that's hosted by Alaska Pacific University, that I also unfortunately do not recall the name of specifically, but myself, I'll put my contact information in the chat, and anybody who's interested can reach out to me. I can get their contact information. It's their whole business that they just started over the past couple of years, is essentially this framework. And also James Temte, who is not in the room presently, but he knows these individuals very well as well. So I'll throw my contact information in the chat. But again, thank you so much. This has been really insightful.
No, thank you. I love, yeah, the story maps. It reminded me how also, I didn't mention this, but another cool thing about them is they are very easy to learn how to use. You don't need to know how to use ArcGIS to use them. And also the free version is like actually like still really comprehensive. I think it's like you just can't have just like voice recordings in the free version, but otherwise you can have sort of a lot of the different functions of like slideshows, of videos, photos, etc. So yeah, they're a really fun tool to use.
Was it January Scott with Ravens Group that was the evaluation? Oh, all right, January Scott, Ravens Group. January is really great. She has a lot of experience in, K through 12 opportunities as well for youth. Really big in education. So yeah, she's a great contact. We can forward or share her information too. Are there any other? I saw a hand in the back.
I was going to say in Alaska, it's the Northwest Boreal Partnership and the Alaska Conservation Fund, or Foundation, sorry, Alaska Conservation Foundation. They do a lot of this Indigenous surveys. I work with them directly. I'm with the Native Village of Akluna, and this is part of our daily operations in running a land department. So you have to learn how to talk with the grantors, which are normally federal, and talk in their language, but do stuff through the Indigenous culture. So you have to learn how to talk both languages to get it to work. But something I also wanted to bring up is you need to make sure you make your part or your connections and sit down and talk with people, whether it be online or in person, because if you don't have that conversation, you're not going to get any information whatsoever. And it doesn't matter. It could be something as simple as going and sitting down at a lunch with somebody, or going and sitting beside an elder who's sitting at a bus stop. And just sitting for 5 minutes, you can have your questions in your head that you would like to get an evaluation on, and just kind of bring them up in conversation. And it is amazing how much information is gathered that way. And so you're not doing it formally, you're doing it very informally, but you get a lot more information. So yeah, I know I have a poster in the next room later, and I would say 90% of that information on that poster was gathered this way.
Hi, Carrie. Good to see you in person. I have another comment or question in the room. Get my steps in.
Thanks, Carly. Martel, I was wondering if you could comment on Tribal IRB, Institutional Review Board for evaluation, because that's different under Tribal IRB than the regular IRB that a lot of institutions have.
Yeah, definitely. So anytime, anytime you're collecting data with Indigenous communities, even if it's with like urban Native communities, working through a tribal IRB is 100% the best practice. And those, if you're not familiar, those are unique because they take into those considerations. And also, I don't have time to get into the different worldviews that our communities have that can differ, and the subtleties and the ways that those differ in thinking about research and planning research. But that's the job of a tribal IRB. So they are tools that you should be utilizing if you want to respectfully and effectively work with Indigenous communities, even if you're working with urban communities. We also use them for all of our programs. So there's lots of different ones. I'm not sure what folks in Anchorage use. I know for us, we'll often go through the Northwest, Northwest, Indian College, or also through the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board are the two main tribal IRBs that I've worked with in the past. But I'm sure you have lots of colleagues up there that could inform you of if you're curious about what tribal IRBs you would want to go through, that'd be most appropriate. Sometimes there's also some, right, like informal or some other mechanisms too, if there's not a tribal IRB for a specific area, but maybe there's like some sort of like community review process that's in place. So, right, making sure you have those relationships and that knowledge of the community so you can plan and approach collecting data in a respectful way that honors the sovereignty of tribes and Indigenous people is really critical. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, there is the Alaska Area IRB, especially if you're doing health-related studies or research. So there's some context you can find online as well. Another note, there's this new training. It's not new, but it's kind of making its way. It's called Our Ethics, and it's more an Indigenous-focused CITI training. I know a lot of people who do like quote unquote qualitative studies have to go through IRB institutional training in order to even go out in the field and go to communities and work with people. So there's a training called Our Ethics. I'm actually going to become a trainer. So, if you're interested, maybe next year we can connect and I could host a session on Our Ethics. But again, it's a more kind of Indigenous focused ethics IRB training. Are there any other questions, comments? Let me check my app. We have a question.
Yeah, well, I just wondered, Martel, this was such a wonderful training. You covered so much in a short period of time. I know we're hoping to have a longer version in the spring, and I wondered if you could just share, in the longer version of this training, what more would you cover so that we can invite people to come join us for that as well?
Yes, gladly. In our longer version, we have a lot more interactive discussion. It's normally, we'll limit it to like 30-ish participants, so we can have like breakout rooms and share and talk with other people, because like I said, a big part of this work is learning from each other. And we also just share a lot more examples, sort of the different, tools and ways that we've implemented Indigenous evaluation. And there's also a really fun visual logic model activity that we spend like a good chunk of time doing as well during the longer version of the training.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Anybody online? I'm not seeing anything else. Oh, we do have one in the room. 1 second.
Hi, I'm Abby York from Arizona State University, and so this is something our projects have been grappling with for a while, and just thinking about data. And so I'm thinking about data coming out of these processes, and we've been trying to look into best practices, but I'd love to hear more about sort of data, knowledge sovereignty, and like helping communities to maintain or provide space and sort of center their, self-determination and sovereignty in those processes. If you have sort of ideas about best practices, or also platforms or other things that can provide spaces for that, would love to hear it.
Yeah, no, I think there's lots of different ways to do that. And it really, right, it always sort of depends on the community that you're working with. But like I said before, I think involving like community members from the very beginning can be like a really important part of that, especially right in thinking about like what's important to the community, like what's the story that the community wants to tell about this program, right? Because sometimes what might be most important to the funders isn't always going to like match what's most important to the community. So how can you make sure that you're also going to capture what the community cares about? And then that will also help like, increase that engagement and keep the community engaged in the process too. And doing that like in an authentic way, not just like, oh, you'll get this one little thing or we'll do this one activity, but how can you have that continuous ongoing relationship? And I guess I'm curious, like for platforms, do you mean like specific, like could you expand upon that?
Yeah, so this is, I mean, not necessarily just about evaluation data, but just thinking about data and knowledge more generally. And so we've been exploring like, how can we support community archived and maintained data? And like, we've been learning about some new platforms that are out there, but if there are some that you know of that are great, that because, like ASU does have resources. We have the National American Indian Data Center and things like that. But just, I'd love to hear like best practices in terms of just data generally, including evaluation data. Like, where is it housed? And obviously that's where, comes to your conversations with communities. But from your experiences, what are good places or suggestions we can have as we're having these conversations?
Totally. Yes. Okay. Thank you for expanding upon that. So yeah, some of the examples I guess I can share and how, we've shared evaluation data in the past is like also like, how can we get creative with it? How can we combine like artwork, like with qualitative evaluation, for example. So we've done like sessions where we have like an artist like sit in and like listen to like a facilitated community conversation. And then the artist like by the end of it, there's this beautiful piece of artwork that then has the story that will like kind of like summarize from the community. And then we like have shared that with all of like the urban Indian organizations across the country. So that's, kind of maybe like a more abstract, like qualitative, like way of sharing qualitative data in that knowledge that was generated in community. Other ways, I know Urban Indian Health Institute, we really love like data dashboards. So we've used Tableau for that in the past, and I haven't been directly involved in that. But every time we've developed like data dashboards, we usually work also like with an Indigenous artist and kind of make sure like whatever we are gifting back to the community is also like beautiful because right, that's practicing that our Indigenous values of reciprocity, how if we want to give something back to our community, we want to make sure it's the best it can possibly be. So, making sure that, and obviously that it's easy to use, that it's accessible, that it has information that's relevant. So, right, I think oftentimes we don't want to like overload our communities. And while, they should be able to access whatever data is about their community, that's part of data sovereignty. If we're developing these tools to effectively communicate this data with folks, is then, we have to be realistic and be like, well, we can't show every single statistic and graph. So then how can we understand what's most important to the community, what's most relevant right now, and then making sure we're highlighting those to ensure that, whatever tool we're sharing is going to be useful. Yeah, hopefully that helps answer the question a little bit.
Yeah, we have a couple, well, really only a minute left, but yeah, I think, Indigenous data sovereignty, it's really about governance of collection of data, of ownership of data, or application of data, and, tribal rights to manage their own data as well. So if you want to work with a community, collaborate with a community, some communities have formal research protocols that you should really become familiar with before even reaching out. Sometimes they're online, and that's something to look into as well. I know that Dr. Stephanie Russo-Carroll is a big champion of Indigenous data sovereignty, and the University of Arizona has a lot of resources, networks who are, forming policy and direction on what this looks like and how this looks like in practice and in community with community. There's a lot of podcasts and presentations, so we can share more of those resources too. And again, thank you so much, Martel, for joining us. It's been really great to have you, and we look forward to welcoming you back in the new year for a much longer training. Could I get a round of applause?
Thank you.
All right, well, that concludes the session, guys. I think we're going into a break. There's also some